What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I've got a very special game for you. In this game, Magnus will be disrespecting a very young Hans Niemann on move 1. That's right, the disrespect happens on the first move of the game. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus his new rival Hans Niemann from the 2022 Miami FTX Crypto Cup. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1a3, a very disrespectful move as promised. He is mixing things up against Hans Niemann. Now Hans, he is not phased. He goes d5, then d4, then knight f6, knight f3, and now the key idea, he goes bishop f5 in the spirit of the London opening, but from Black's perspective. So Magnus, how will he deal with Hans Niemann and his reversed London opening? Well, he goes c4, gaining space on the queen side, a very strong move and very typical for the queen's gambit. Now here, Hans Niemann, his main ideas as usual in these queen's gambit structures are d takes c4, c6, and e6. In this game, he does go c6 in the spirit of the Slav opening, a very interesting choice. Now we have knight to c3 and then e6 in the spirit of the semi-Slav. So here, Hans Niemann getting that famous pawn triangle on c6, d5, and e6 with the London-style bishop outside the pawn chain. Not a bad achievement so far in this game. But of course, Magnus, he is not done. He goes knight to h4, pressuring that bishop on f5 right away, f5, excuse me. And here, Hans, what will he do in response? Well, first of all, you don't want to leave that bishop on f5. If you do, then knight takes, then e takes would be a very good transformation of the position from White's perspective. Therefore, you do have to go either bishop g6 or e4, forcing out f3 and then go back to g6. Those are the best options here. But so far in this game, Hans Niemann, he's been doing fine. But right here, he makes the first big mistake of the game. He actually goes bishop g4, and this is a major strategic mistake. The bishop just does not belong on that g4 square. The problem with that is White can just go h3 and then g4, driving back that bishop anyway, and h3 and g4 are beneficial for White's position. So for example, the strongest line here is just h3 and then g4, driving it back, taking on g6, and then g5, driving back the knight, and White would have a massive initiative. But instead of all that, in this position, Magnus goes f3, and this move is actually a little bit of a mistake as well. It returns the favor, allows Black to go bishop h5, and for now, that bishop cannot be attacked on the h5 square. Yes, you could go g4, but that would be a massive weakening move, not to mention having problems on this diagonal. I mean, Black could likely go, I don't know, knight takes g4, opening up the attack of the queen on the knight, threatening, queen takes h4 check ideas. So g4 is not an attractive move at all, and that means that bishop will be staying alive for a while. All right, now Magnus, how does he want to continue? The main lines here for White are, say, g3, e3, queen to b3, and c takes d5. In the game, c takes d5 chosen, c takes d5 played by Hans Niemann, the right recapture, heading for sort of a symmetrical exchange Slav style position, but with the knight and bishop on the edge of the board, which is a little bit weird. All right, now Magnus, g3 played in the game, giving the bishop on g2 a good square to go to, or maybe even the knight, or maybe even the king with king to f2, then g2, as that is a somewhat typical idea in these slow Slav style positions. All right, now Hans Niemann, knight c6, develops the knight, and now sure enough, knight g2 played by Magnus Carlsen, a very provocative move. Maybe he wants to go, say, knight f4, pressuring the bishop. That would be a decent idea, but overall, this plan is very, very slow, and it will give Hans Niemann plenty of time to fight for the advantage here. All right, Hans Niemann, queen to b6 is the move, developing his queen and setting up potentially, if he wants to, the idea of long castles. And again, that is not the rarest idea ever in these slow Slavs positions. All right, now Magnus, e3 is the move, defending d4. Of course, it was being attacked twice by the knight on c6 and the queen on b6, so e3, a very necessary defensive move. All right, now Hans, bishop d6, a very flexible move, a good square for the bishop, and now Hans is ready to castle on either side of the board, depending on what Magnus does. All right, here, Magnus, it turns out his best way forward is just bishop e2, slow development, intending short castles, maybe king f2 instead, and so on. And overall, White would be doing relatively okay. It's not a whole lot to write home about. Yes, Black is a little bit better, but, that's kind of the best you can do right here as White. Now, Instead of playing it safe, here Magnus plays a very provocative move, knight to f4, jumping up with the knight, and the computer does not like this move one bit. Here, black can take on f4, and no matter how white recaptures with the g-pawn or the e-pawn, black would have a very large advantage as white's pawn structure in the center and on the king side would be very, very weak, and the king on e1 would never really have a good place to go to, as the pawns are just too far advanced on the king side. There's too much loft around the king. So here, bishop takes f4 is the best move, but instead, bishop g6 played by Hans Niemann, and here, Magnus is starting to fight back in the game. This move is very inaccurate and falls right into Magnus Carlsen's hands. So here, Magnus, he takes on g6, knight takes g6, then h takes, and then the bomb cloud style move, king to f2, artificially castling his king, and believe it or not, this move is very common in the slow Slav when white goes for an f3 and g3 based setup. So the king on f2, despite looking a little bit awkward, that it is very safe there, and this is very thematic for this kind of pawn structure. All right, now here, Hans Niemann, a6 is the move, guarding b5, stopping knight b5 and bishop b5 ideas, and keeping his king in the center for now. Now we have king g2, as promised, fianchettoing the king all the way onto the g2 square, and now here Hans Niemann finally does castle his king. So, short castles played in the game, Hans Niemann opting to get his king to safety on the king side, but in return, giving up that active placement of the rook on the h8 square where it was slicing down the open or semi-open h file. All right, now here, Magnus Carlsen, how should he be playing this very weird pawn structure? Well, it turns out here, f4 is actually the right way forward according to the computer, but that move looks very strategically strange to me. You're giving up e4, you're giving up g4, you're giving up control of the light squares in general, so f4, the computer loves it, I don't quite understand it. Instead, in the game, g4 was played by Magnus Carlsen, and this move looks maybe even worse than f4. I mean, here Hans Niemann has the potential to strike in the center with the move e5, and that is what the hopeful future world champion does. He goes e5, breaking in the center, threatening e takes d4, then after e takes, queen takes, winning a pawn. Therefore, Magnus here will have to respond immediately. In the game, he does not take on e5. No, he goes g5. He is all in with that g-pawn. Now here, the knight has to move, or does it? In the game, e takes d4, played instead, ignoring the attack on the knight. The point being, if you take on f6, then d takes c3, threatening c takes b2, hitting the bishop and the rook would be very dangerous. So instead here, e takes d4, played by Magnus Carlsen, and now again, that knight is under attack. It must move. Where is it going to go? In the game, Hans Niemann, he goes knight to h5, putting his knight on the rim, but here in this position, that knight is not dim at all. It is eyeing the f4 square. Knight to f4 or bishop f4 ideas will be coming in the near future, so that knight is not dim despite being on the rim. All right, now knight takes d5, played in the game for white, winning that free pawn, hitting the queen on b6, but Hans Niemann, he is still doing just fine. And here, if Hans Niemann finds one very precise move, he will have a decisive advantage, maybe not decisive, but very, very large advantage in this middle game, and that is the move queen to d8, keeping the queens on the board. The reason you want to do that instead of queen takes d4 is that white king on g2 is very naked and very vulnerable. It's like my dad's favorite TV show, Naked and Afraid. That king on g2 is just naked and afraid. Therefore, you want to go queen d8, keeping the queens on the board and putting pressure on that pawn on g5. Instead here, Hans Niemann, he makes a very critical strategic mistake. He goes queen takes d4, trying to head into an endgame. But first of all, this move is bad for, well, two reasons actually. First of all, you are giving up a very large portion of your advantage. Again, that white king is so vulnerable, you want to keep the queens on the board. But second of all, Hans Niemann should know better. Magnus is literally the best endgame player of all time. You simply don't want to go into the endgame against this guy. He is just too dangerous. All right, queen takes d4, then knight takes, and then rook to b1, getting out of the potential knight to b3 idea by Hans Niemann. This wasn't forced at all. There were other moves, but overall, rook b1, not a bad move at all by the GOAT. All right, now, rook fd8, played by Hans Niemann. Hans still has the advantage in this endgame. His pieces are a little bit more active. It will take some time for white to get his kingside pieces out into the game, and that does give Hans Niemann a little bit of a temporary advantage. But again, Magnus is slowly but surely fighting back in this endgame. So bishop d3, rook a to c8 played, missing the opportunity to play the slightly stronger move, bishop e5, defending that knight on d4 preemptively. Instead, rook a to c8 played by Hans Niemann, and now we have rook d1, exerting some x-ray pressure on that knight on d4. Now ideas like bishop takes g6, opening up the attack again on that knight could be dangerous. All right, now knight e6 played in the game, retreating the knight out of the x-ray attack and pressuring g5. Now we have bishop e4. Magnus again, slowly but surely improving the placement of his pieces and pressuring b7 via the x-ray attack. Now king to f8, Hans slides his king over, bishop d2 is the move, and now we have knight h to f4. Now, this move, in theory, is very principled. That knight on the rim was a little bit dim, therefore you do bring it over to the center, trying to activate it. However, here in this position, this move was a little bit dubious, and white is going to run away with the advantage. Now we have knight takes f4, then knight takes, and then king to f1, sliding back with the king, and now here, white has mostly untangled his position, and now the key imbalance in this position is that white bishop pair. I mean, we all know how incredibly dangerous Magnus can be with the bishop pair. He's just a monster, and these pawns on the queen side, they're going to be just ripped to shreds by these two bishops controlling literally every square, slicing across the board. So Hans Niemann, he is in the fight of his life just to hang on here. So in the game, b6 played by Hans, trying to guard that pawn. But now here, sure enough, bishop b7 played. The two bishops getting to work, hitting both the rook and the pawn on a6, and there is no good way to keep the rook and the pawn alive. So rook b8 played in the game, then bishop takes a6, and now Magnus is officially up one pawn, plus the bishop pair. This is getting ugly. All right, knight to e6 played in the game, retreats the knight, then bishop c4, putting pressure on that knight once again. Knight d4, again jumping out of the attack. And now king g2, jumping up with the king and defending that pawn on f3. And it turns out g2 right now is a very good square for the king. There are still a lot of pieces left on the board. Therefore, you do have to think about king safety at least a little bit. All right, now rook b to c8 played by Hans Niemann. Now bishop a6, again, that bishop pair getting to work, pressuring the rook once again. Magnus is just relentless. All right, rook c7 defends the rook. Bishop c3, pressuring the knight on d4 with the other bishop and the rook on d1. Now knight d6 defends the knight. Now we have a4 gaining space on the king side, or queen side, sorry. King to e7, h4, the alpha 0 h pawn enters the game, defends g5, and here Magnus makes Hans Niemann, he makes yet another mistake. Here the best move for Hans is rook to h8, pressuring that pawn on h4. Instead, he goes knight to f4, jumping in with the knight, pressuring the king on g2, but now the king slides out, king to f2, the knight jumps back to e6, and now we have bishop b5. So Magnus here slowly but surely improving his position. And Hans, he is just going back and forth. There's nothing he can do. He is just SOL right here. And beyond that, of course, Magnus has the very simple plan of just b4, a5, getting a pass pawn on the queen side sooner or later. All right, now Hans, rook to h8, sliding the rook over to the semi-open h-file, pressuring the alpha 0 pawn on h4. But now we have rook h1 defending. All right, now bishop c5 hits that king on f2, king to g3. Magnus stepping out of the attack of the bishop. Now bishop d6 once again hits that king, and once again the king steps out of the attack. King to g2. Now there are no more checks with this bishop. What will Hans do? He goes knight f4, again harassing that king. King f2 played in the game. Bishop c5, king g3. And here it turns out the right move for Hans is knight to h5, jumping back with that knight and pressuring the king on g3. But instead, knight to e6 played. Again, Hans Niemann retreats the knight, maybe intending bishop d6, but here, Magnus, rook b to e1, pinning the knight on e6 to the king. Magnus is untangling. All right, bishop d6 hits the king again, king g2, and now Hans fights for counterplay on the king side. f6, the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack, a good move, threatening g5, but also giving up a little bit of the defense of that knight on e6. All right, now rook to e4 played in the game, potentially intending rook h to e1, doubling up rooks on that very vulnerable knight. Now we have f5, driving back that rook. Rook to c4, slides it over, offers the rook trade. Now we have, again, knight f4. I think this knight has gone back and forth like 4 to 5 times so far in this game. Very strange. King to f2. Again, the king moves. Bishop c5. Again, that check comes into play. And here Magnus finds a brilliant move to put an end to Hans Niemann and his little mind games with these checks with the knight and the bishop. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the brilliant move played by the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, right here in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, here, the key idea for white is rook takes c5. The rook sacrifice. What is the point? It's very simple. If you take back with the rook as played in the game, then the move is just bishop b4, pinning the rook to the king. You win that piece back very, very fast. All right, now knight e6. Again, retreating that knight back to e6. That knight just loves that square in this game. Now we have bishop takes c5. Magnus not messing around. He's not waiting to win that rook immediately. Then knight takes c5. Then b4 drives back that knight. Knight to e6, again, the knight going back to its favorite square. And here the best move for white is simply a5, getting a pass pawn one way or another. But instead, bishop c4 played in the game. I guess the idea is to pressure that knight on e6 and threaten bishop takes, which may or may not be a good move. But here Hans Niemann, he's not messing around. He goes knight d4, getting out of the attack. Then we have rook to e1, hits the king on e7. Then king d6, stepping out of the attack once again. Rook d1, again, pinning that knight to the king, and then we have king to e5, again defending. All right, now here, Magnus finds a very strong move. He just goes f4, hitting the king, and the point being, if you take that pawn, then the rook on d4 falls, or the knight on d4 falls, and you lose the game instantly. Instead here, Hans Niemann, he's forced to go king to e4. That is the only square maintaining the defense of the knight. If you go back to d6, then the knight on d4 would fall. So king d4 played in the game. Now bishop f1, threatening bishop g2, and that move would be deadly. The only way to delay mate would be knight f3, and then bishop takes, believe it or not, would be checkmate, as the bishop, the pawn, and the rook control literally, plus the king, control literally all of the squares of the king. Therefore, king d5, or something similar, was forced by Hans Niemann, and now finally we have the move a5, getting that pass pawn on the a file or the b file, depending on what Hans Niemann does here. All right, b takes a5, then b takes, then rook b8, activating the rook on the open b file, but Magnus a6, he pushes the pawn, and it is supported by the bishop on f1. Therefore, that pawn is very, very safe, and here Magnus is going to have the option of going bishop g2 sooner or later, and the bishop, very importantly, will control the queening square. That is just so important. All right, king c5 played in the game, then rook c1 hits the king, king d6, and here it turns out rook d1 is the right way, retreating with the rook, but instead king to e3 play by Magnus, and this does give Hans Niemann slightly higher drawing chances in this game. All right, knight c6 played, retreating the knight. Then we have rook c3, jumping up with the rook, knight to a7, defending that a7 square with the knight. Then bishop c4 activates the bishop, rook e8 hits the king on e3, king to f3, slides out of the attack, then rook to e7, and this move turns out to be a little bit dubious. Instead, rook to e1, keeping the rook as active as possible, threatening ideas like rook to a1 in the future was the right way forward. And now here, Magnus, he cuts off the rook on the e file, rook to e3 played, offering that rook trade. Of course, if you trade rooks, that pass pawn on a6 will decide the game. It will be a distraction and give the white king enough time to march up the board and gobble up all these pawns on the king side. So you cannot take on e3. Hans Niemann knows this. Any potential future world champion would know that. He goes rook d7, sliding the rook out of the attack. Then rook d3 hits the king, king to c7, rook takes, king takes, and here Magnus, bishop to f7. And here in this position, almost 99% of grandmasters would resign on the spot. But Hans Niemann, he is a fighter. He plays on king to c6, ignoring the threat on the pawn on g6. Now, of course, Magnus does take bishop takes. Now Hans king b6. Hans is fighting on, but now h5. That pawn will be a passer in very short order. Now knight to c6. Hans trying to bring his knight back to the defense, but now h6, g takes, and g takes. And here in this position, Hans Niemann, he realizes there is no way to get his knight to a square that would defend h8. For example, f7 and g6 are the only squares to do that. I mean, it's just not going to happen. If you go, say, knight e7, bishop to f7, controls g6, and again, Hans Niemann, he's nowhere close to defending that pawn going to h8, and for that reason, he simply resigns on the spot to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and a very young Hans Niemann at the 2022 Miami FTX Crypto Cup, where Magnus disrespected his young opponent on move one. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this game. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know if you're Team Hans or Team Magnus, so comment down below. And if you want to see more Hans versus Magnus action, check out this video right here, where I covered a crazy game where Magnus invents a brand new opening against Hans Niemann in the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. It's a new opening that has never been played before in the history of chess. The novelty occurs on move like maybe 4 or 3, if I remember, 3 to 4, something like that. So the game was crazy. Check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.